Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
You're watching Adventures in Music Theory with your host, Dr. Robbins.
So hello and welcome to the Thursday, April 23rd edition of Online 20th Century Idioms course. Coming you today from our sunny back porch. Bitsy and I decided we'd get outside and do this. And there's not any music to actually play, so we can do that. But there is a law against playing 12-tone music outdoors in South Carolina, apparently, so we're good. But last time we looked at 12-tone rows, talked about these concepts like combinatoriality and things like that. And I had mentioned that there's something even more stupefying and horrifying going on in serial music than what we've been looking at thus far, which is serial dodecaphony, basically 12-tone works and stuff like that. And that thing is that idea of integral serialism, which is an idea that takes root in the 1940s. There are some composers who come up with the thinking that Schoenberg did not go far enough with his idea about serializing pitch. And they realize that we can have a matrix or a series to control our pitch successions and which pitches we write. It can be predetermined by the matrix. So what if there was a way to devise a matrix that would control the other things that happen in music besides pitch? Duration, intensity, timbre, articulation, things like that. And that's where we get this concept of integral serialism or total serialism happening. Two early figures in it, one of whom is not really a serial composer. It's Olivier Messiaen, the guy with all the modes of limited transposition and the guy who's into non-retrogradable rhythms and things like that. In 1949, Messiaen writes a work, and one of the movements in the work he writes is a movement called the or the mode of values and intensities, which is a movement where he went through and applied serial thinking to rhythm, which is what the values are, and dynamics, which is what the intensities are. That's a piece he composed in 1949, which is generally seen as being an early example of composers trying to serialize parameters beyond pitch. He didn't really do much more with it than that. It wasn't what he was about. He wasn't a serial composer. The guy who did more with it is an American composer named Milton Babbitt, who in 1947, a couple years before Messiaen actually, wrote a work called Three Compositions for Piano, in which he actually did apply serial thinking to things beyond pitches. And we'll look at one of Babbitt's works in a minute, but let's look at how this might be done, because you might be sitting there trying to figure out, so how do you actually serialize something that's not a musical pitch? We'll talk. Well, one thing Messiaen serialized was intensities or dynamics. And one easy way to do this is to do with dynamics what composers can be seen as doing with pitches, which is perhaps you just choose a succession of dynamics, just the way a composer might choose a succession of pitches for a matrix, and that can be an arbitrary thing. So, for instance, I might choose, have I got 12 dynamics there? I think I have like 8 or 9 dynamics there, but I might take my dynamics and just put them in some sort of order of my own choosing and consider that to be one of my row forms, my prime row form perhaps. And then, of course, the idea of inversion is tricky, but you might think, well, the opposite of soft is loud, and piano is soft, so forte is loud, so maybe the inversions could look like that. And that might be one way that the composer could go about using a dynamic row in his or her composition. You might also do the same thing with durations. You might choose any number of rhythmic durations and put them in a row, have a durational row. And likewise, you could do that with articulations. Think about staccatos, legatos, marcatos, tenutos, things like that. Choose those, put them in a row, and assign them based on different workings of the row. And of course, the thing is, if you could find 12 of each of these things, and you were writing a 12-tone work that had 12 pitches in your matrix, then you could do what you do with pitches to dynamics and durations and articulations. You could turn them into numbers and have one matrix to sort of rule the whole piece of music. Whether or not it actually works that way or not is another discussion perhaps. But this is part of where composers found themselves going in the years after World War II, is there are some composers who are looking for ways to totally control the composition process through these set external things such as serialism, and the idea of being able to serialize every aspect of a piece of music seemed to composers a way to make their music less emotional and more cerebral, which is something that a fair amount of composers after the Second World War started doing. This is also really kind of that period in history where you have composers coming about who start deciding that maybe instead of being seen as artists and expressors, they should be seen as scientists, and they should go hang out in universities and just do research that was music composing in this new scientifically constructed style. Whether or not that's actually how most composers actually view themselves now or not that's another discussion as well. But there are still people out there who view composition this way, and throughout the 1950s and 60s, the dominant school of composition in most universities was serial composition. I even went to school with people in the 90s who were still doing that stuff. So, it got quite a foothold with composers after the Second World War. Not quite as strong a foothold with performers, and really not much of a foothold with audiences. But it's part of our music history, so we should discuss it. And the part I want to really delve into more deeply is actually rhythm. So that's what we're going to discuss in the next slides here. So here are a few ways we can go about talking about creating serialization of rhythmic values, which are in some ways the things that composers are most interested in serializing beyond pitch. Because if you think about it, rhythm and pitch are really our most objective expressive aspects of music. B flat is a very, very definite thing in a sense. A 16th note is a definite duration. Mezzo piano kind of depends on who's playing it and stuff like that. Likewise, other aspects of music, but rhythm and pitch are the things that are the most quantifiable. So they're the things that lend themselves best to being serialized. And I mentioned one aspect that can happen is the idea of just putting rhythmic values in a succession or creating a rhythmic row. There's a little rhythmic row that has like, I think 9 pitches or 9 notes in it. You could do it that way. Not everything has to add up to 12 elements. In fact, even with pitches, that's not the case. I mentioned to you all that Stravinsky was fond of writing serial works where there would only be like 5 or 7 or 9 pitches that he was working with. So a lot of times when composers are thinking about serializing rhythm and stuff that's not pitch, they don't necessarily feel like there have to be as many rhythmic elements as there are pitch elements. We do 12 pitches because there are 12 pitches when we divide in half steps, but you could be happy to say I'm only going to deal with 8 dynamic values or 6 rhythmic values or something. But there's this idea of just putting notes in a row and seeing what happens. The other idea that actually can be seen to lend itself well to a 12-tone approach is this thing called time point. And I'm putting it in 3/4 time, because the nice thing about 3/4 time is you can take a measure and you can divide it into 12 16th notes, real nice and tidy like that. And basically what time point would do is this. It would like assign each note a point in time where it happened. And one way a composer might do that is to look at his pitch matrix and see what was actually going on with the pitches in a piece of music. Like here I've got in that little black box, I've got a tone row or a pitch row written out, that 0, 1, 5, 8, 10, 4 business. What I've got written above it underneath all the 16th notes, I've got the integers 0 through 11 assigned to all 12 notes in that measure. And a way a time point might work is this. If you were writing in 3/4 time, or whatever time, you could simply decide that you were going to treat the rhythmic row the way you'd treat the pitch row, and you were going to like make your rhythmic values go 0, 1, 5, 8, 10, 4, just like you might make your pitch values go 0, 1, 5, 8, 10, 4 if you were doing that form of a row. So it might look like this. And what's going on there actually is when I go to create rhythms based on that row in the top of the little box there, since it starts out 0, 1, 5, 8, the first rhythmic placements I play are going to be on 16th notes 0, 1, 5, and 8. And you can sort of see the 0 note is the first 16th note in the measure. The 1 note is the second 16th note. The 5 note is the one that happens 1/16th note after the second beat. The 8th note is the one that happens on beat 3. But you could take this approach, and this is a time point approach. I mean, there are pluses and minuses to this. One plus to it, I suppose, is this would be a way of controlling your rhythmic values from a pitch matrix, because there are 48 different row forms on the matrix. Well, there are also 48 different time forms on the matrix, because I could start that row backward and just write my rhythms to go 6, 11, 2, 9 and put my placements there. I guess a downside of it is you have to wait a long time for the next note to come around sometimes. Like look at 4 and then look at how long we have to wait to play the next note if we have to wait to put it on placement 3 in the next measure. That's a long time to wait, but that's a way to do it. If you don't like time point, you might also think about doing something like what's called a durational row, where notes are given a set duration based on the number that would come to them from the matrix. For instance, let's assume we were dealing with a hexachord in a matrix that went 3, 2, 6, 5, 2, 8. One way I might decide to interpret that rhythmically is with a little rhythmic pattern like what you're looking at right there, where the 3, 2, 6, 5, 8 come out being expressions of how many 16th notes are in each note value, right? The dotted eighth has 3 16th notes in it, and the 2 tied 16th notes are, well, worth 2 16th notes. The 2 tied dotted eighth notes are worth 6 16th notes. The 16th tied to the quarters equal to 5 eighth notes, or 5 16th notes, excuse me. The single eighth note is equal to 2 16th notes. But everything here has a duration that is being based upon a musical expression that could happen in pitch through that 3-2-6-5-2-8 formation. So, a few things to think of, and we'll look at this a little bit more closely in the next composition we're going to look at here. And the composition we're going to look at is a composition by Milton Babbitt, appropriately enough, called Semi-Simple Variations. And I thought what we might do first is we'll start off by doing a go for what you know here. And what we've gotten fairly practiced at over the past couple of sessions is being able to find tone rows, pitch rows. So I want to first look at just how Babbitt is using pitch in this work. He's drunk the 12-tone Kool-Aid, and at this point he's even selling the total serialism Kool-Aid on the corner of his neighborhood. So he's serialized rhythm and pitch in this piece. Let's look at pitch first. And the way to find the row in this piece, he's got sort of a different approach to how he puts his rows out than we've seen in other pieces. Like we looked at the Dalla Piccola last, where he used row forms melodically and just went across or up and down the matrix or whatever and got a row form that way. And we've seen sometimes how the composer sort of wanders the row through the fabric of the piece, and some of it will be in the melody and then it'll follow down into the accompanying part, and then it might emerge back up into the melody. All of that's legitimate stuff. All of that distributes the 12 pitches around and creates that tonal aggregate that keeps us from perceiving any one pitch as the tonal center, which is what these guys wanted. Babbitt's taking a stratified approach to his pitches here. And I'll show you exactly what that means as we go on here. But one place to find the tone row is in the highest voice. It's in the notes that are upstemmed in the top staff. So if you want to go in and start finding one form of the row, go in and just look at the pitches that are sticking up in the right hand part of the piano part. The B flat, F sharp, E, A flat. I've gone through and I've integer numbered them all out using fixed zero because that's my new thing now. I like it. If you look, you'll notice that in the first 12 measures of the piece, Babbitt gets through all 12 pitch classes in that uppermost stratum there. So that's a form of the row. And if we were going to build a matrix, we might decide, well, since that's the row I got first, I'm going to make that the top row of my tone row. So I'm going to call that a prime row. And since it starts on B flat, I'm going to call it P10. There are worse things you could do. So here's what the matrix looks like when you go through and you do all that stuff. And this matrix is actually a little bit like the matrix that Babbitt built in that very first Babbitt piece I showed you all, the play on notes thing that was for voices and bells, and it just had 2 hexachords going on, and then you realized, oh, there aren't actually that many rows. Same thing going on here. Look at the top row, P10. It goes 10, 6, 8, or 10, 6, 11, 8, 7, 9, 3, 1, 2, 5, 0, 4. And now look at the bottom row, the retrograde, which would be R4. It goes 10, 6, 11, 8, 7, 9, 3, 1, 2, 5, 0, 4. It's the exact same sounding thing as the top row. If you play the top row from left to right, it's going to give you the exact same order of pitches as if you play the bottom row from right to left. And just like in the play on notes song, that's going to be the case with the second row down and the second row from the bottom. They both are the same, one going forward, one going backward, but the second row starts out 2, 10, 3, 0. You start the second row from the bottom from right to left, and it goes 2, 10, 3, 0 all the way to the end. Same deal with the third row from the top and third row from the bottom, fourth rows from the top and bottom, fifth rows from the top and bottom, and those 2 middle rows that are the sixth rows, which means that, okay, so we've got that prime form that starts on B flat labeled. I call it P10. And now let's figure out what's going on in the other parts. It's always what's going on in the other parts that can give you headaches in this stuff. That prime form is kind of easy to find because it's easy to see. All the notes are up-stemmed in the right hand. This piece exists in like 4 different pitch levels, and the other 3 levels are harder to get because they're beamed together. The notation doesn't explicitly show it quite as nicely. But one way to find another stratum is to look at some of the lowest pitches. Like if you want to, well, the lowest pitch at the beginning is that C sharp, which is 1, and then the next lowest pitch is the F, which is 5, and then there's a C natural in measure 3 that's 0, and there's an E flat at the end of measure 4 that's 3. If you follow this through, eventually you'll get a row form that goes 1, 5, 0, 3, 4, 2, 8, 10, 9, 6, 11, 7. And this is hard because it's hard to get the matrix and the score at the same time because if I get it on one slide, they won't be easy to see. So let's go look at the matrix real quickly. Remember 1, 5, 0, 3, 4, 2, 8, 10, 9, 6, 11, 7. Okay, and if I go looking on my matrix for 1, 5, 0, 3, whatever comes after that, then I'm going to find that it's actually going to exist on this matrix in 2 places. One place you'll see it is if you look on the very top row where you see the number 1 and then start going down, there's 1, 5, 0, 3, 4, 2. There's our row form, what we could call I1, the inversion form that starts on 1. The other place where you're actually going to see it is go across the bottom and find the number 1 there and start reading it up from the bottom, 1, 5, 0, 3, 4, 2. Same thing. The row form that starts at the bottom and ends on 7, the thing that we would call RI7. So there are 2 different things that incorporate this. It could be seen as row I1, it could be seen as row RI7. And on my analysis here, I've got it labeled RI7. For no good reason other than simply when I first went looking on the matrix to find that row form, I saw it from the bottom to the top rather than the top to the bottom. So I called it RI7 rather than I1. For this particular work, because of the peculiarities of the rows, they're both correct. Just like that first row up there that's called P10 could also be called R4 because it's the same as the retrograde version of the row that ends with 4 there. But at any rate, let's look at what happens next. Okay, and now let's look at some inner voices here. We've got some outer voices. We've got the P10, we've got the RI7 as our highest and lowest strata respectively. Let's look at some of the middle parts. There's basically a middle part written in the left-hand part that's the A's to the G's, and there's an inner voice written in the right-hand part that's like the D to the E flat to the C. So we could go through and single some of those out. And then the green print that's on the screen for you now, you'll see that I've gotten some of the notes in that lower part of the right hand singled out, the D, E flat, C, which is 2, 4, 3, 0, 5, and then ending on the D flat 1. Well, that's only 6 notes. That's only half a row. It's a hexachord. And that's all Babbitt's actually going to mess with in this particular instance, because that actually gets him through the theme. Remember, this is a variation form, and you'll notice that variation 1, as he sees it, is starting in measure 7 down there. So with our outermost voices, the highest voice and the lowest voice, there were 2 complete row forms that actually went through the theme and the first variation. For that inner voice, he only writes half a row, and it gets us through just the theme, the first 6 measures. And again, we'll yank up our matrix and see if we can find that tetrachord that goes 2, 4, 3, 0, 5, 1. And there, circled in that little blue oval, is 2, 4, 3, 0, 5, 1. It would be the last half of a retrograde inversion row. If you started at the bottom on 7 and played up, then it's the way you would end the retrograde inversion row that we call RI1. Now, of course, it's also on there somewhere else as well. It's It's also the last half of inversion row I7 from the top to the bottom. If you go halfway down, then you'll see that it goes 2, 4, 3, 0, 5, 1 there as well. Again, what I chose was to go with that retrograde inversion row just because. So we've got that hexachord that we could label as the second hexachord of RI1. And that would give us something we could work with there. And now we can look at that fourth stratum of pitches we didn't deal with yet, the inner voice that's in the left-hand part that goes A, G, A flat, and on and stuff like that. And I'm going to mark it in orange. So the A is 9, the G is 7, the A flat is 8, the B that comes next is 11. In measure 5 down there, the G flat is 6, and the B flat at the end is 10. And it's another hexachord. In fact, interestingly enough, what you might notice is that particular hexachord, 9, 7, 8, 11, 6, 10, that's happening as the inner voice in the left hand, is also the retrograde of what's been done in the uppermost voice, the P10 thing. It goes 10, 6, 8, 10, 6, 11, 8, 7, 9. And while that's been happening underneath it, those notes that are marked in gold are 9, 7, 8, 11, 6, 10. And he just uses half of a row or a hexachord in that lower voice there as well. So that could be either seen as part of a retrograde row. It's the second hexachord of R10, or of course there's also some prime row on the matrix that's going to start out going 9, 7, 8, 11, blah, 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 blah as well. And in fact, it's the hexachord that's at the very bottom right of this matrix that you see down there that goes 9, 7, 8, 11, 6, 10. But again, I labeled it as the end of the retrograde row up top, second hexachord of R10. You could also label it as the second hexachord of P4 because they're the same pitches. And we could stay here all day having fun tracking the pitches through this piece and its various variations, but let's go ahead and talk about the monstrous, horrible, poison vampire elephant in the room that would be the serialization of rhythm in this piece. So buckle up, it's going to be fun. So here's how Babbitt handles rhythm in this piece. He doesn't actually get his rhythms from the matrix using prime forms or anything like that, or time point or anything like that. Instead, he creates different serialized forms for his rhythms, but he creates a rhythmic row of unique note values. And that rhythmic row is 16 quarter notes long. And when we go back and actually start looking at the notes in the piece again, we're going to notice that each variation or each section of the piece, at least at the beginning there, tends to be 16 quarter notes long. When you add up the various measures of 2/4 and 3/4 and like variation 1 and variation 2, you realize, oh, it's a total of 16 quarter notes in each one of those. So that's going to work well for the row Babbitt wants to work with. And the reason why he's going with 16 is because he's working with 16th note values, and he realized that when you think about the fact that on any given quarter note, there are 4 places where a 16th note can go. It can go on the first, second, third, or fourth quarter note. And you could also have silence on our first, second, third, or fourth 16th note. And you could also have silence in the form of a rest on the first, second, third, fourth, or 16th note. He realizes that there are basically 16 possibilities of having sound and silence. Here they are. You can have sound on all 4 16th notes, like happens on that very first beat there. Dot, 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 dot. 4 16th notes. Or you can leave one of your 16th note spaces blank with a rest, which is what the next 4 little beats show. Note, 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 rest. Note, note, rest, note. Note, rest, note, note. Or rest, note, note, note. And then, from there, you could have 2 notes and 2 silences, and you could have note, note, rest, rest, note, rest, note, rest, rest, note, rest, note, note, rest, or, rest, note, rest, note, rest, rest, note, note. And then there are the possibilities for having 3 silences and 1 note. Note and 3 rest, 1 rest and then a note and 2 rest, 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 note, rest, and rest, 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 note. And of course the final possibility is then 4 silences. So those are the possible ways it can happen. Let's look at how Babbitt actually makes it happen when he decides to compose his rhythmic row. And that's on the next slide here. This is Babbitt's rhythmic row prime form. Da 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 da. Hey, that was pretty good. Anyway, that's his rhythmic row, the prime form. So, there aren't going to be 48 different versions of this because the idea of being able to transpose it to different pitch levels doesn't exist. But he is going to have 4 forms of it. He's going to have a prime and an inversion and a retrograde inversion. And let's look at how he goes about getting those. Let's take the easiest one first. Let's think about what the retrograde would be like. Well, retrogrades are easy. Monkeys can do retrogrades. Basically, you just take what you've got and you do it backward. So I've got the retrograde version of the row showing up there right now. And if you'll look, you realize that what's happening from left to right on the top row is what happens from right to left on the bottom row. So the prime form starts out with 4 notes and ends with 4 rests. The retrograde form starts with 4 rests and ends with 4 notes. And things correspond from there. So he's just taken his row and done it backward. And in so doing, he's created a retrograde form of the row. The way he thinks about inversion is actually rather clever. Because if you think about it, inversion is, in a sense, having a thing find its opposite. When we invert an interval, we make that interval the opposite of what it was. What was on the bottom is now on the top. When we invert a melodic line, we make it to where it did go up, now it goes down. Where it did go down, now it goes up. So Babbitt's sort of thinking, well, what would be the way to find opposites for things in my rhythmic row? And there are basically 2 elements in the row: sound in the form of a note and silence in the form of a rest. So what's the opposite of sound? I'm assuming you raised your hand and then said silence. Right. So what we're going to do to make the inversion is this. We're going to make the inversion by replacing sound with silence and replacing silence with sound in the prime form. And if you look at that inversion row that's on the 3rd line there, you can see that that's exactly what's happening. The prime form starts out with 6 notes. And then there are 5 silences in the forms of rest. If you look at the inversion row at the bottom there, it starts out with 6 rests and then 5 sounds in the form of notes. So all he did to create the inversion is he replaced every note with a rest and every rest with a note. And then the retrograde inversion, you're just going to do that same type of thinking to the retrograde row. The retrograde starts out with 4 rests and a note and a rest and 2 notes. So the retrograde inversion is going to start out with 4 notes and a And this is what it looks like when it goes to be actual music. And this is where the headaches begin. And this is where brain cells start to die in the way I don't like them to die and stuff. So anyway, what's happening in these first measures we're looking at here is Babbitt is composing his pitches that we know come from the matrix, and he's choosing his rhythmic values based on the prime form of his row. And it's tricky for 2 reasons. One reason it's tricky is because no single voice is stating a row form. No, I mean the rows look all nice and neat. The prime form looks da 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 da, and it looks like there's going to be some part chattering doing that. But in reality, he's going to take all those notes and distribute them through the 4 different pitch levels he's got going on. The other thing that's tricky is this. Babbitt doesn't really write his notes out in the composition the way they look in the rhythmic rows. In the rhythmic rows, it's all 16th notes and 16th note rests. Babbitt doesn't want to write just 16th notes and 16th note rest in this piece. You know, if you look, there are a lot of long note values, a lot of sustained notes and things like that. So what Babbitt's really interested in is what we call the attack point, the time at which a note gets played. And if you look at that top 4 measures I've got written out there, and you think about what would I hear if I actually just did these rhythmically, if I tried to recite the rhythm that's going on in the top line, what would it sound like? It would sound like da 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 da, and on and on and on. It would sound like those rhythmic values down in the prime form. But it's hard to see that. So I'm sending up all those arrows so you can hopefully see how each note from the prime form is represented in the measure with its attack point. And just looking in the first measure, you know, the first 6 notes are all a 16th note apart, yada da 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 da. And they represent the first 6 notes in the prime form. So the rests don't actually always get expressed as rest. Sometimes there are long notes instead, like that long B flat that's holding over there. But that's how Babbitt is going to work his way through this. And he works through the first measures, what I guess are the theme, the first 16 beats, using the prime form of his rhythmic row. So when we get to variation 1, Babbitt changes his rhythmic row, and he uses the retrograde version of the rhythmic row. And if you look at how the retrograde works, it's down at the bottom of the page there for you. You can see the first thing in the retrograde is 4/16 notes worth of silence, which Babbitt writes. He just writes a quarter note rest for it. He's not going to write 4/16 rest. He writes the quarter note rest. And then if you look at the second beat of the retrograde row, it's got a sound on the first 16th note and on the third and fourth 16th notes. And that's what happens in the first variation starting on beat 2. In the right hand, that high E flat is happening on the first 16th note, and then those 2 notes that go from the left hand to the right hand are happening on the third and fourth 16th notes. And then if you look at the third beat or measure or whatever, the retrograde row, you realize that it's got silence on the first 16th note, and then sound on the second and third 16th notes, and silence on the last 16th note. And that's exactly what the last beat of that 3/4 measure that begins variation 1 looks like. The other thing I want us to take a moment to notice here is we can actually see all of variation 1 on the page there. Variation 1 ends at the end of what you're seeing on the slide there. So variation 1 has a 3/4 measure and a 2/4 measure and 2 3/4 measures and a 2/4 measure and a 3/4 measure. So we add that up and you realize that's 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 3 is 8, plus 3 again is 11, plus 2 is 13, plus 3 is 16. It's 16 beats long. So Babbitt goes through a complete statement of his rhythmic row, since the variation is 16 quarter notes long. And if we look at the very, very end of the music, down there are a bunch of notes at the end of the last measure, starting on that, everything's in treble clef now, so starting on that B in the left hand, the notes jump from the left hand to the right hand, and they go B, C, E flat, E, G, A flat. Notice they're all a 16th note apart, so they all sound like yada da 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 da. And before those 6 16th notes played, the thing that happened was actually there were 5 16th notes of silence, just like happens in the retrograde row before those 6 notes. In fact, if you look at the last 3 beats or measures of the retrograde row, they sound like this. Da, 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 which is exactly what rhythm you would get if you played that last 3/4 measure on the piano. Does that make sense? I want it to make sense. Okay, and here's variation 2. And this is all of variation 2 as well. You can see everything there is to see there. It's 16 beats of music, so it's a complete variation. And rhythmically, the row he's writing here it's one of the ones that starts with 4 sounds and not 4 silences. So it's either a prime form or a retrograde inversion form. And it's actually a retrograde inversion form that he's writing here. And if you'll look, you'll see that that's kind of how these measures would sound. Every note that's happening is finding a place in the measure based on where the retrograde inversion form of the row says it should go. Right? The retrograde inversion row says the first thing that happens is there are 4 sounds, and the first thing that happens in this variation is 4 16th notes split between the 2 hands. Then it says there's a silence, which is that 16th rest on beat 2, and then it says there's a sound, which is that chord on the second 16th note, and then it says there are 2 16th notes worth of silence. That's your 8th note rest. And then it says there's a sound, and then 2 16th notes worth of silence and another sound. And that's the end of measure 13. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay. And if we look at how it ends, again, let's look at that very, very last 3/4 measure, which corresponds to the last 3 beats or measures of the retrograde inversion row at the bottom of the page. It says there's silence, then 3 16th notes and 2 16th notes, and then 6 16th notes worth of silence. And when we look at the actual notes, what we'll see is there's a 16th note rest at the beginning of the measure, silence. Then there are 3 16th notes at the end of beat 1, and 2 16th notes that play on beat 2. And then notice I see a G, but that G is tied out, so it's not actually sounding. So the end of the measure is 6 16th notes worth of non-attacks. That G is ringing, but there's not anything being attacked or played. So does this make a little bit of sense about how a composer might go about finding a way to control rhythm the way he controls pitch in a serial composition? This was something that people were very into in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So think on this for a while. This might be one of those videos you want to watch more than once. That's probably not the right thing. This might be one of those videos you need to watch more than once. And I suppose that now it's all over except for the crying. And crying, of course, means assignment for next time. So for next time, I want us to look at an early 12-tone piece, so we don't actually need to deal with issues of total serialism. This is in the time before that. This is Schoenberg, the piano piece, Opus 33A. And I want you to figure out what his tone row is. Build whatever type of matrix you want to build for the tone row. You can build pitch class matrix or movable zero or fixed zero matrix. I'm going to do a fixed zero integer matrix, and that's probably what I'm going to be teaching off of when we go over this piece online on Tuesday. But what I want you to do is figure out the row. I'll give you a hint. When you get the score, don't go to the first measure. It'll drive you crazy. Look at measures 3 through 5. They will help you figure out a row form. And after you've figured out your matrix, I want you to look at the first page of the score and label the row forms he's using on the first page. Now, the reason I say that it might drive you crazy and not to look at measures 1 and 2 is because this is what the piece looks like. All those chords. And chords are such horrible things to try to build a series off of. So, like I say, it's better to wait till you get to measures 3, 4, and 5, and things start to like spread out and become more single pitch oriented. And once you get to those measures, I think you can find the row contained in those measures fairly easily. I wouldn't recommend looking elsewhere. Go to measures 3, 4, 5, see if you can find it. And then once you find it, all those bizarro chords in measures 1 and 2 will make some sense. I will tell you also that the row that you're looking for in measures 3 and 4 and 5 is almost exclusively housed in one hand of the piano part. That's the only hint I'm going to give. So take care till next time. On Tuesday, we'll get back and we will go over this piece, which I will be analyzing too. I am officially one class ahead of you now because I've never analyzed this work before. And we will talk about what's going to be on your test on next Thursday. So enjoy. I will see you then. Stay safe, stay happy.